In the aftermath of the Second World War, as Soviet forces occupied much of Central and Eastern Europe and Communist parties consolidated power across the region, Moscow faced a strategic problem that extended beyond military control, because the survival of the emerging Eastern Bloc depended not only on the presence of Red Army formations, but on the continuous political reliability of Allied governments whose legitimacy was fragile, whose societies were war-scarred, and whose leadership cadres often lacked deep popular support. And it was within this context, beginning in 1948, that Soviet intelligence services assumed a central role in preventing fragmentation by embedding surveillance, control, and enforcement mechanisms directly into the governing structures of Allied communist states. The primary objective was not ideological persuasion, but regime stability, defined in operational terms as the early detection and neutralization of nationalist deviation, factionalism, and independent political initiative that could weaken Moscow's strategic perimeter at a moment when confrontation with the West was intensifying. And to achieve this objective, Soviet intelligence did not operate as an external observer, but as an internal presence, integrating advisors, liaison officers, and covert assets into the security and party organs of satellite states, thereby transforming local intelligence services into extensions of Soviet control. In the late 1940s, this system took shape rapidly, driven by the perception that wartime alliances and revolutionary legitimacy were insufficient guarantees of long-term loyalty, especially as economic hardship, post-war reconstruction pressures, and lingering pluralist traditions created conditions in which dissent could incubate beneath the surface of formal political conformity, and Soviet intelligence assessments emphasized that fragmentation was most likely to emerge not through open rebellion but through elite deviation, policy drift, or the quiet erosion of party discipline within national leaderships. As a result, Moscow prioritized the establishment of comprehensive surveillance over Allied communist governments themselves, with particular attention to ministries of internal affairs, party central committees, and military commands, where independent networks could form if left unmonitored. This surveillance was institutionalized through bilateral agreements that placed Soviet advisors inside national security services, often with authority that exceeded their formal rank, enabling them to shape investigative priorities, vet personnel, and direct counterintelligence operations against both real and potential threats. And these advisors reported not only through local chains of command, but directly back to Moscow, creating a parallel information channel that bypassed national leaderships and allowed Soviet authorities to assess reliability without mediation. The intelligence logic underpinning this arrangement rested on the belief that fragmentation would begin at the top rather than the bottom, that deviations by senior officials could cascade downward, and that early intervention was therefore essential. And this belief was reinforced by wartime experience, during which shifting allegiances and nationalist agendas had complicated Soviet operations even among nominal allies. From 1948 onward, Soviet intelligence reporting increasingly framed Eastern Europe as a zone of permanent vigilance, where ideological unity had to be actively enforced rather than assumed. And this framing justified a level of intrusion into Allied sovereignty that would have been politically untenable in a looser alliance system. The establishment of these mechanisms coincided with the intensification of Cold War confrontation, including the breakdown of wartime cooperation, the formation of Western security structures, and the emergence of a divided Europe, developments that reinforced Moscow's conviction that any sign of fragmentation within the bloc could be exploited by external adversaries, turning internal dissent into a strategic liability. Within this environment, Soviet intelligence services expanded their remit beyond classical espionage to encompass what amounted to internal bloc governance, monitoring not only opposition elements but also the behavior, loyalties, and interpersonal relationships of Allied leaders, assessing who could be trusted, who required pressure, and who might eventually need removal. This system was particularly focused on the late 1940s purge campaigns that swept through several Eastern European states. Campaigns often justified publicly as defenses against imperialist infiltration, but driven operationally by intelligence assessments that identified perceived national deviation and insufficient subordination to Moscow as existential risks. And while these purges varied in intensity and local execution, they shared a common intelligence, backbone in which Soviet guidance shaped targets, methods, and outcomes. The prevention of fragmentation was thus pursued not through a single centralized operation, but through a continuous process of surveillance and intervention, calibrated to local conditions, but unified by a strategic objective that subordinated national autonomy to bloc cohesion. And by the early 1950s, this process had produced a networked security environment in which Allied communist governments operated under constant observation, aware that their internal deliberations and policy choices were subject to external scrutiny. The effectiveness of this system was measured not by public stability alone, but by the absence of autonomous political trajectories, and Soviet intelligence evaluations treated compliance as a dynamic condition that required reinforcement, particularly during moments of stress such as economic crises, leadership transitions, or popular unrest, which were seen as tests of the surveillance apparatus rather than anomalies. By the time the bloc entered the mid-1950s, the intelligence structures designed to prevent fragmentation had become embedded features of governance, shaping how Allied regimes perceived both their populations and their relationship with Moscow, and establishing a model of control that relied less on overt coercion alone than on the continuous anticipation and neutralization of deviation before it could mature into organized challenge, a model that would define Soviet management of the Eastern Bloc throughout the early Cold War period. As the surveillance architecture matured between 1949 and the early 1950s, Soviet intelligence refined its methods for managing Allied communist governments by shifting from the initial phase of institutional takeover to a more systematic process of internal monitoring and enforcement. Because once local security services had been reorganized and staffed with cadres vetted under Soviet guidance, the central challenge became maintaining discipline over time rather than imposing it through episodic purges alone. And this required intelligence practices that could detect subtle forms of deviation before they manifested as overt political conflict. Soviet advisors, therefore, emphasized continuous reporting on the internal dynamics of party leaderships, including factional alignments, policy debates, and personal rivalries, treating these not as normal features of governance, but as potential indicators of fragmentation risk. And this reporting was synthesized in Moscow to produce comparative assessments of reliability across the bloc, allowing the Soviet leadership to rank Allied regimes according to perceived stability and responsiveness. Within this framework, intelligence collection extended beyond formal institutions into the informal networks through which power actually flowed, including patronage relationships, military loyalties, and economic decision-making channels, because intelligence doctrine held that fragmentation would most likely arise where national interests, personal ambition, and local political realities intersected in ways that diverged from Moscow's priorities. The Soviet response was to ensure that Allied intelligence and security services mirrored Soviet practices in structure and outlook, creating a common operational culture that facilitated coordination and reduced the likelihood of independent initiative. And this standardization was reinforced through training programs, shared doctrine, and the regular rotation of advisors who carried institutional memory from one country to another. At the same time, Soviet intelligence cultivated redundancy, encouraging multiple reporting channels within each Allied state so that no single local authority could control the flow of information, a practice designed to prevent concealment of dissent and to ensure that Moscow received early warning of emerging problems, even if local leaders attempted to manage them quietly. This redundancy extended to the monitoring of the security services themselves, as Soviet advisors evaluated not only political loyalty but operational effectiveness, vigilance, and adherence to guidance, recognizing that a complacent or nationally oriented security apparatus could become a liability during periods of stress. The early 1950s presented several such stress tests, including economic dislocation caused by rapid industrialization, social resentment toward collectivization and political repression, and the psychological impact of Cold War confrontation. And Soviet intelligence assessments treated these pressures as background conditions that increased the probability of deviation rather than as catalysts in their own right, reinforcing the belief that surveillance over elites was the decisive factor in preventing fragmentation. Within Allied governments, the presence of Soviet intelligence influence shaped decision-making behavior as leaders calibrated policies not only for domestic effect, but for how they would be interpreted in Moscow, an effect that intelligence reports captured in detailed accounts of internal debates, where conformity was often prioritized over effectiveness. This dynamic created a feedback loop in which surveillance reinforced caution. Caution reduced visible deviation, and reduced deviation was interpreted as proof of stability, even when underlying social tensions remained unresolved, and Soviet intelligence doctrine accepted this trade-off, privileging predictability over adaptability in the belief that the former was essential for maintaining bloc cohesion during confrontation with the West. The death of Stalin in 1953 introduced a new variable into this system, as Allied leaders watched closely for signals of change from Moscow, and intelligence services were tasked with assessing whether the succession altered the standards by which loyalty would be judged. Yet even during this uncertain period, the Weidesukti surveillance apparatus functioned without interruption, continuing to report on Allied leadership behavior with the same rigor, a continuity that underscored how deeply intelligence control had been institutionalized. Soviet evaluations during this transition emphasized vigilance against misinterpretation, warning that Allied leaders might mistake tactical adjustments in Soviet policy for a loosening of control, and intelligence reporting was used to identify and correct such perceptions before they translated into autonomous action. By the mid-1950s, the cumulative effect of these practices was an Eastern Bloc in which formal sovereignty coexisted with an embedded intelligence regime that constrained political movement, monitored elite behavior, and provided Moscow with a granular picture of internal conditions, enabling preemptive intervention when necessary and reducing the likelihood that fragmentation could develop unnoticed. A system whose effectiveness rested less on constant repression than on the omnipresent awareness that deviation would be detected and addressed long before it could threaten the cohesion of the bloc. The events of 1953 and 1954 reinforced the centrality of intelligence surveillance in Soviet efforts to prevent Eastern Bloc fragmentation, because the succession crisis following Stalin's death exposed the potential for miscalculation among Allied regimes, even as it demonstrated the resilience of the control apparatus that had been constructed during the preceding years, and Soviet intelligence services responded by intensifying their scrutiny of Allied leadership behavior to ensure that uncertainty at the center did not translate into experimentation at the periphery. Intelligence reporting from this period focused heavily on detecting shifts in tone, policy emphasis, and internal discourse within Allied communist parties, treating even modest deviations from established orthodoxy as signals that required evaluation, not necessarily because they posed an immediate threat, but because they could accumulate into patterns that, under conditions of reduced central authority, might accelerate fragmentation. The suppression of unrest in East Germany in June 1953 further validated the intelligence-first model of control, as Soviet security assessments highlighted the importance of early warning and rapid response. Noting that while military intervention had ultimately restored order, the underlying lesson was that surveillance over labor organizations, party cadres, and local administrators could have provided earlier indicators of escalation, thereby reducing the need for overt force. In response, Soviet advisors pressed Allied security services to deepen penetration of social and economic institutions, expanding informant networks and refining reporting protocols to capture changes in sentiment and organizational behavior that might precede political challenge. This expansion was not framed as repression for its own sake, but as preventive governance, an approach that assumed that fragmentation was most dangerous when it emerged unexpectedly and therefore had to be anticipated through exhaustive information collection. At the elite level, Soviet intelligence placed renewed emphasis on monitoring personal relationships and informal influence networks within Allied leaderships, recognizing that succession dynamics in Moscow could encourage local leaders to reassess their positions and alliances, and intelligence assessments sought to identify those most likely to misread the situation as an opportunity for greater autonomy. The removal of Beria in late 1953 reinforced this vigilance, as it underscored that internal power struggles could result in sudden reversals and that Allied leaders needed to be reminded, implicitly if not explicitly, that the standards of loyalty and discipline remained unchanged despite shifts at the top. Soviet intelligence thus functioned as both an information gathering and signaling mechanism, conveying to Allied regimes that Moscow's attention had not lapsed and that deviations would be noted regardless of leadership transition. Throughout 1954, this approach was reflected in the handling of policy debates within Allied states, where intelligence reports documented how proposals for economic adjustment, administrative reform, or limited political liberalization were evaluated not only on their domestic merits, but on their conformity with Soviet expectations, and where security services intervened preemptively to discourage initiatives that might be interpreted as independent trajectories. This preemptive intervention often took the form of internal party discipline, personnel reshuffles, or quiet warnings rather than public purges, indicating a shift toward more calibrated methods of control that relied on surveillance-backed influence rather than mass repression alone. The effectiveness of this approach lay in its ability to maintain outward stability while minimizing the visibility of coercion, thereby reducing international scrutiny and preserving the appearance of voluntary alignment within the bloc. From Moscow's perspective, intelligence-driven oversight allowed for differentiation among Allied regimes, enabling tailored responses that accounted for local conditions while preserving overall cohesion, and intelligence assessments compared levels of risk across the bloc, identifying where additional pressure or guidance was required and where existing controls were sufficient. By the end of 1954, Soviet intelligence had institutionalized a model of bloc management that treated fragmentation as a continuous risk to be managed through information dominance rather than episodic crisis response, a model that integrated surveillance into everyday governance and normalize the presence of external oversight within nominally sovereign states. This normalization had long-term consequences for the political culture of the Eastern Bloc, as leaders and officials operated within an environment where alignment with Moscow was not merely a diplomatic necessity, but an operational reality enforced through constant observation. And this environment reduced the space for autonomous decision-making, even in areas not directly related to security, reinforcing the structural dependence that defined the bloc during its formative years. As the early Cold War moved toward the mid-1950s, the Soviet intelligence role in preventing fragmentation had thus evolved from an emergency measure into a stable system, one that reflected a strategic calculation that cohesion could be preserved most reliably, not through trust or ideology alone, but through the disciplined application of surveillance, reporting, and preemptive control embedded at every level of Allied governance. By 1955, the cumulative effects of sustained intelligence surveillance had reshaped the internal operating environment of the Eastern Bloc in ways that reduced the likelihood of overt fragmentation while embedding long-term dependencies that constrained political evolution. Because the Soviet approach had moved beyond the initial consolidation phase into a mature system of control that relied on information superiority to manage Allied regimes with precision rather than blunt force. Intelligence reporting from this period reveals an emphasis on normalization, in which constant observation and routine intervention became accepted features of governance, allowing Moscow to maintain influence without the frequent resort to dramatic purges or military action. And this normalization was reinforced through institutionalized coordination between Soviet intelligence and Allied security services, including regular consultations, shared threat assessments, and standardized procedures that aligned local practices with Soviet expectations. Within Allied governments, this produced a climate in which policy formulation was inseparable from anticipatory compliance, as leaders evaluated decisions through the lens of how they would be interpreted by external observers whose judgments carried direct consequences for political survival. A dynamic that intelligence services both monitored and reinforced by selectively signaling approval or concern. The strategic rationale for this approach rested on the assessment that fragmentation was most dangerous when it emerged incrementally through policy divergence, rather than explosively through rebellion, and intelligence doctrine therefore prioritized early detection of divergence in areas such as economic planning, cultural policy, and foreign relations within the bloc, treating these domains as potential vectors for autonomy that required oversight even when they appeared peripheral to security. Soviet intelligence also adapted its methods to account for variation among Allied states, recognizing that historical experience, national identity, and social structure shaped the forms that deviation might take, and intelligence reporting sought to contextualize local developments within a broader comparative framework that allowed Moscow to anticipate which regimes were more likely to test limits under changing conditions. This adaptive surveillance was evident in the way intelligence assessments differentiated between tactical adjustment and strategic drift, an analytical distinction that informed whether intervention was deemed necessary or whether alignment could be maintained through guidance alone. The effectiveness of this system was reinforced by the integration of intelligence findings into party-level decision-making, ensuring that information about Allied reliability influenced appointments, resource allocation, and diplomatic engagement, thereby tying intelligence evaluation directly to the levers of power. As a result, Allied leaders faced not only the scrutiny of security services, but the cumulative consequences of unfavorable assessments that could manifest in reduced support, increased oversight, or eventual removal, even in the absence of overt disloyalty. From the Soviet perspective, this intelligence-centric model provided a means of managing the inherent contradiction between ideological claims of socialist solidarity and the practical need for hierarchical control, allowing Moscow to maintain the appearance of unity while enforcing discipline through largely invisible mechanisms. The period also highlighted the limits of this approach, as intelligence reports occasionally warned that excessive surveillance and intervention risked alienating local elites and populations, potentially creating the very instability the system sought to prevent. Yet, these warnings were typically subordinated to the overriding priority of cohesion, reflecting a strategic calculation that short-term stability outweighed long-term legitimacy concerns. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet intelligence role in preventing Eastern Bloc fragmentation had thus crystallized into a doctrine of preventive control, one that accepted the permanence of tension within Allied societies, but sought to contain it through continuous monitoring and selective intervention. And this doctrine would shape bloc management in subsequent years as new challenges emerged, providing a framework that emphasized anticipation over reaction and information dominance over reliance on overt coercion as the primary safeguard against fragmentation. As the early Cold War moved beyond the immediate post-war consolidation phase, the intelligence system constructed to prevent Eastern Bloc fragmentation revealed its deeper strategic purpose, which was not merely to suppress dissent, but to institutionalize a hierarchy of dependence that reduced the probability of independent political evolution, even in the absence of crisis, because by embedding surveillance into routine governance, Moscow ensured that Allied regimes internalized the logic of compliance long before coercion became necessary. Intelligence reporting from this period shows that the Soviet leadership increasingly relied on comparative analysis across the bloc to identify patterns of risk, measuring levels of discipline, responsiveness, and ideological alignment in ways that treated Allied governments as components of a single strategic system, rather than autonomous actors. And this analytical approach allowed Soviet authorities to allocate attention and pressure selectively, intensifying oversight where deviation appeared more likely while maintaining lighter touch supervision where conformity was judged stable. The prevention of fragmentation thus depended not on uniform repression, but on differentiated control guided by intelligence assessments that captured the nuances of local political culture, leadership cohesion, and social tension. And these assessments informed decisions about when to intervene directly and when to allow limited latitude as a means of preserving overall stability. This calibrated approach was particularly evident in the management of leadership transitions within Allied states, which Soviet intelligence treated as moments of elevated risk analogous, on a smaller scale, to the succession crisis in Moscow, prompting heightened surveillance and rapid reporting to ensure that new leaders adhered to established lines and did not reinterpret change as opportunity for autonomy. Intelligence advisors played a key role during these transitions by shaping security vetting, influencing personnel choices, and reinforcing the expectation that continuity, rather than innovation, was the measure of reliability, thereby narrowing the range of acceptable outcomes before leadership changes fully unfolded. At the same time, Soviet intelligence maintained a close watch on inter-bloc interactions, monitoring communication among Allied governments to detect any coordination that bypassed Moscow or suggested the emergence of shared interests not mediated by the Soviet center, because such horizontal linkages were viewed as potential foundations for collective deviation that could undermine the hierarchical structure of the bloc. This vigilance extended to regional forums, economic planning bodies, and military coordination mechanisms, all of which were subjected to intelligence scrutiny to ensure that cooperation reinforced rather than diluted central authority. The strategic environment of the early 1950s reinforced this emphasis, as confrontation with the West remained intense, and Soviet planners assessed that any sign of fragmentation could be exploited externally to weaken the bloc's deterrent posture, making internal discipline a matter of strategic defense rather than ideological purity. Within this context, intelligence surveillance functioned as an early warning system, not only for political dissent, but for shifts in perception, enabling Moscow to gauge how Allied leaders interpreted international developments and to correct narratives that might encourage independent alignment or accommodation. By sustaining this information advantage, the Soviet leadership reduced uncertainty and preserved control during a period when economic strain, social dissatisfaction, and leadership change might otherwise have produced centrifugal forces, and this reduction of uncertainty was itself a strategic asset, allowing for more confident decision-making at the center. By the mid-1950s, the cumulative impact of these practices was an Eastern Bloc characterized by formal unity and suppressed divergence, maintained through an intelligence regime that emphasized anticipation, differentiation, and preemptive correction, and this regime constituted a central pillar of Soviet strategy in Europe, shaping the political landscape in ways that would endure beyond the specific time frame of 1948 to 1955. As the system stabilized, fragmentation did not disappear as a risk, but was managed as a latent condition, continuously monitored and constrained by intelligence mechanisms designed to ensure that deviations were identified and addressed before they could coalesce into systemic challenge, reinforcing a model of control that privileged cohesion over autonomy and surveillance over trust as the foundation of bloc stability. In the final assessment of the 1948 to 1955 period, Soviet intelligence emerged not as a supplementary instrument, but as a core mechanism through which Eastern Bloc cohesion was engineered and preserved. Because the prevention of fragmentation depended less on episodic displays of force than on the continuous management of political reliability across a diverse set of Allied states whose historical experiences, social structures, and leadership dynamics varied widely, and intelligence surveillance provided the means to reconcile this diversity with the strategic requirement for unity. By embedding itself within the security and party institutions of Allied governments, Soviet intelligence transformed sovereignty into a conditional status, formally intact but operationally constrained by constant observation and the implicit threat of intervention, a condition that shaped behavior long before overt crises could develop. Intelligence reporting from this era reveals a system oriented toward anticipation, in which the primary objective was not to respond to rebellion, but to prevent the emergence of independent trajectories by identifying and correcting deviations at their earliest stages, whether those deviations appeared as policy experimentation, leadership realignment, or shifts in ideological emphasis. This preventive logic rested on the assumption that fragmentation was most dangerous when it matured quietly, and that overt unrest represented not the beginning of instability, but its late manifestation, a failure of earlier detection, and Soviet intelligence practice therefore prioritized depth of penetration over breadth of coercion, seeking to know more rather than to punish more. The consolidation of this approach between 1948 and 1955 produced an Eastern Bloc that was outwardly stable yet internally constrained, where Allied leaders operated within a narrow corridor of acceptable behavior defined not only by ideology but by intelligence assessment, and where compliance was reinforced through the awareness that deviation would be recorded, analyzed, and acted upon within a centralized system that linked information directly to power. The strategic payoff of this model was a reduction in uncertainty at the center, allowing Soviet leadership to manage a complex alliance structure with fewer surprises during a period of intense international confrontation, even as it accepted the trade-off that long-term legitimacy and adaptability might be sacrificed for short-term cohesion. By the mid-1950s, the intelligence regime designed to prevent fragmentation had become self-sustaining, normalized within Allied governance, and internalized by political elites as an enduring condition of alignment, ensuring that the Eastern Bloc functioned not as a loose coalition, but as a monitored system whose integrity was maintained through continuous surveillance rather than mutual trust. This outcome reflected a deliberate strategic choice shaped by early Cold War conditions, one that privileged control over autonomy and information dominance over persuasion, and it established a pattern of bloc management that would persist in various forms beyond 1955, demonstrating that the cohesion of the Eastern Bloc during its formative years was not an organic product of ideological unity, but the result of sustained intelligence oversight designed to neutralize fragmentation before it could become visible or politically actionable.